A gunshot split the morning air as Wilhelmina Morgan threw herself behind a fallen log, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The stagecoach robbery had happened so fast one moment. She had been traveling peacefully toward Fort Davis, Texas. And the next, she was running for her life through an endless maze of pines and junipers that seemed determined to swallow her whole. The year was 1875, and Wilhelmina Willa, to those who knew her, had left behind everything familiar in Boston to answer an advertisement for a schoolteacher position in Fort Davis. She had never imagined her journey west would lead her here. 3 days lost in the Davis Mountains with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small canteen that had run dry yesterday. Willa pushed a strand of copper hair from her face, wincing as her fingers brushed against the cut on her forehead. The bandits had taken everything: her trunk, her money, even the locket that contained the last image of her parents. The driver and the other passengers had been forced to continue on at gunpoint, but Willa had managed to slip away during the confusion, choosing the uncertainty of the wilderness over the certainty of whatever the outlaws had planned for her. Now, as the third day of wandering dawned bright and merciless, she was no longer certain she had made the right choice. Willa struggled to her feet, her once fine traveling dress now torn and stained beyond recognition. Her boots, at least, were sturdy, though her feet inside them were blistered and raw. She looked up at the sun, trying to remember the advice she had read in a book about wilderness survival. East. She needed to head east. Or was it west? The mountains had turned her around so completely that she couldn't be sure of anything anymore. "Keep moving," she whispered to herself, her voice cracking from thirst. "Just keep moving." Miles away, at the Double C Ranch outside Fort Davis, Darren Caldwell frowned at the tracks in the dust. His weathered hand brushed aside a clump of dried grass to reveal the partial imprint of a boot too small and narrow to belong to any of his ranch hands. "What do you make of it, boss?" asked Javier, his foreman, crouching beside him. "Lady's boot." "Heading into Comanche territory," Darren replied, his voice low and graveled from years of barking orders and breathing trail dust. At 32, Darren had already lived several lifetimes by Eastern standards. Orphaned young, he'd worked cattle drives across Texas since he was 14, saved every penny, and eventually built the Double C into one of the most respected ranches in the territory. He stood, his 6'3" frame casting a long shadow in the early morning light. His dark hair curled from beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and his eyes, the color of a summer storm, narrowed as he studied the horizon. "Stagecoach was robbed 2 days back," Javier offered. "Sheriff Jones said they were a passenger short when it finally rolled into town. Boston lady." "New schoolteacher." Darren nodded, a muscle tightening in his jaw. "Round up Miguel and Sam, we're riding out. You think she's still alive?" "Won't know till we find her," Darren replied, already striding toward the corral where his stallion Thunder stood waiting. "And I aim to find her." By midday, Willa had managed to find a small stream. She fell to her knees on the bank, cupping the cool water in her palms and drinking deeply, not caring that some of it spilled down her chin and onto her bodice. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. After slaking her thirst, she splashed water on her face, wincing as it stung the cut on her forehead. Her stomach growled painfully. She had tried eating berries the day before, but after becoming violently ill, she decided hunger was preferable to poisoning herself. She knew fish swam in the stream. She could see their silvery shapes darting between rocks, but she had no way to catch them. Willa sat back on her heels, trying to marshal what was left of her strength and wits. She was a schoolteacher, educated at one of Boston's finest women's academies. Surely she could figure out how to survive until... Until what? Until someone found her. Who would look for her? She was a stranger in this land. A sound caught her attention, the snap of a twig, perhaps, or the rustle of leaves. She froze, listening intently. When she heard it again, she was certain. Something or someone was moving through the underbrush toward her. Willa scrambled to her feet, searching frantically for a weapon. She seized a heavy branch from the ground and held it before her like a club, backing away from the sound. "Hello," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Who's there?" The brush parted, and Willa's breath caught in her throat. A huge black bear emerged, its small eyes fixed on her. It rose on its hind legs, towering over her, and let out a bellowing roar. Willa did the only thing she could. She ran. Darren and his men had been tracking the woman for hours. The signs were clear to anyone who knew how to read them. Broken twigs, disturbed earth, occasional scraps of fine fabric caught on thorns. Whoever she was, she'd been moving erratically, sometimes doubling back on her own trail. "She's confused," Darren said, dismounting to examine a clear footprint in a patch of mud. "Not thinking straight, probably dehydrated." Miguel, a stocky man with a talent for tracking that surpassed even Darren's, nodded grimly. 3 days out here without supplies. She's tough to have lasted this long. Boston tough ain't the same as Texas tough, Sam commented, adjusting his hat. At 25, he was the youngest of the group, with a perpetual optimism that sometimes grated on Darren. "Tough is tough," Darren replied shortly. "Don't matter where it comes from." They remounted and continued following the trail, which now led toward Creek Canyon. Darren felt a knot of worry form in his stomach. Creek Canyon was known for its population of black bears, especially this time of year when the berries were ripening. The sound reached them before they saw anything. A woman's scream, distant but clear, echoing off the canyon walls. Darren didn't hesitate. He dug his heels into Thunder's sides, and the horse leaped forward, racing toward the sound with the other men close behind. They crested a rise just in time to see a woman, her dress in tatters, her hair a wild tangle of copper running full tilt from a bear that seemed more interested in the satchel she was clutching than in her. Food, Darren realized. She must have found some berries or nuts and gathered them. Miguel. "Sam, spread out," Darren shouted, drawing his rifle from its scabbard. He fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to frighten the bear away without having to kill it. The bear hesitated, confused by the sudden noise and the appearance of horses. It dropped to all fours, huffing and pawing at the ground. The woman kept running, either unaware of her rescuers or too frightened to stop. She was heading straight for a ravine. "Look out," Darren shouted, but his warning came too late. The woman disappeared over the edge with a startled cry. Darren leaped from his horse and raced to the ravine's edge. It wasn't deep, perhaps 12 feet, but the fall would be enough to cause serious injury. He peered over and saw her lying motionless at the bottom. "Miguel, deal with that bear," Darren ordered, already searching for a way down. "Sam, rope." Sam tossed him a lariat, and Darren secured it to a sturdy tree before rappelling down the rocky slope. He reached the woman's side and knelt beside her, relieved to see her chest rising and falling steadily. She was younger than he'd expected, probably in her mid-20s, with delicate features beneath the dirt and scratches. Her hair, though tangled and matted with bits of leaves and twigs, was a striking shade of red gold that reminded him of autumn sunsets. Gently, he brushed a strand of hair from her face, revealing a nasty gash on her forehead that had been reopened by the fall. "Miss, can you hear me?" The woman's eyelids fluttered, and she groaned softly. When her eyes opened, Darren found himself looking into the clearest green he'd ever seen, like spring grass after a rain. "Who?" she began, her voice a cracked whisper. "Name's Darren Caldwell, My men and I are here to help you." He uncorked his canteen and held it to her lips. "Drink slowly." She took a careful sip, then another. "Wilhelmina Morgan," she said, her voice a little stronger. "Everyone calls me Willa." "Well, Miss Morgan, you've led us on quite a chase. Think you can stand?" Willa tried to sit up but cried out in pain, clutching her ankle. I don't think so." Darren examined her ankle carefully. It was already swelling, though he couldn't tell if it was broken or merely sprained. Either way, she wouldn't be walking out of here. "Looks like I'm carrying you then," he said matter-of-factly. "We need to get you back to Fort Davis. Doc Jenkins will take a look at that ankle and the rest of you." Before she could protest, Darren had scooped her into his arms. She was too light, he thought with concern, noting how her collarbone protruded beneath her torn dress. 3 days without food would do that, especially to someone who didn't have much extra to begin with. "My men are waiting up top," he explained as he carried her to the rope. "We're going to have to haul you up. It might hurt, but it's the only way." Willa nodded, her jaw set despite the pain evident in her eyes. "I understand." With careful maneuvering, Darren created a makeshift harness from the rope and secured it around Willa. She bit her lip to keep from crying out as he worked, but couldn't suppress a whimper when he tightened the last knot. "Ready?" he asked, and when she nodded, he called up to Sam and Miguel. "Pull her up. Gentle now." Willa closed her eyes as she was lifted, swaying slightly in the air. The pain in her ankle was excruciating, but she remained silent, focusing on the fact that she was being rescued, that after 3 days of terror and solitude, she was no longer alone. When she reached the top, gentle hands helped her onto solid ground. Darren appeared moments later, climbing up the rope with an agility that spoke of years of similar experiences. "The bear?" he asked, looking around. "Headed back into the woods," Miguel reported. "Guess he decided we weren't worth the trouble." Darren nodded and turned his attention back to Willa. "Miss Morgan, these are my men Miguel Sanchez and Sam Turner. They're the best trackers in the territory, which is how we found you." Willa managed a weak smile. "Thank you, all of you. I don't know how much longer I could have." Her voice trailed off as a wave of dizziness washed over her. The world tilted alarmingly, and she felt herself falling again, though this time into darkness rather than a ravine. Darren caught her before she hit the ground. "She's exhausted and dehydrated," he said, lifting her once more. "We need to get her to town." Miguel stepped forward with a bedroll. "Wrap her in this. Nights get cold and she's already been through enough." Darren nodded, grateful for his foreman's foresight. Once Willa was wrapped snugly in the blanket, Darren mounted Thunder with her cradled against his chest. "Follow me home," he said softly to the unconscious woman, though she couldn't hear him. Then to his men, "Let's ride." Willa drifted in and out of consciousness as they traveled, vaguely aware of the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the solid warmth of the man who held her. Occasionally, she would open her eyes to find herself looking up at a strong jawline dusted with dark stubble, or feel a calloused hand adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. "Rest," he would say whenever he noticed her awake. "We're almost there." But almost there seemed to stretch on endlessly, and eventually, Willa surrendered to the blackness again. When she next opened her eyes, she was lying in an unfamiliar bed in a small, tidy room. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, casting dappled patterns on a patchwork quilt that covered her. She was wearing a nightgown that wasn't her own, and her ankle had been bandaged and propped up on a pillow. "Good morning." Willa turned her head to find an elderly woman sitting in a rocking chair beside the bed, knitting needles clicking softly in her gnarled hands. "I'm Mrs. Abernathy," the woman said with a kind smile. "Dr. Jenkins asked me to sit with you while he tended to Mrs. Peterson's new baby." "Where am I?" Willa asked, her throat still painfully dry. Mrs. Abernathy set aside her knitting and helped Willa take a sip of water from a glass on the bedside table. "You're in Fort Davis, dear, in the doctor's house. Mr. Caldwell brought you in 2 days ago, half dead from exposure and with that nasty ankle." 2 days, Willa echoed, shocked. "I've been asleep for 2 days. Your body needed the rest. Dr. Jenkins gave you something to help you sleep while he set that ankle. It's not broken, just a bad sprain, but you won't be walking on it for a while." Willa sank back against the pillows, trying to process everything. "Mr. Caldwell, is he still here?" Mrs. Abernathy shook her head. "He had to get back to his ranch, but he's been by to check on you each day." "Left those, in fact." She nodded toward a vase of wildflowers on the dresser. Before Willa could respond, the door opened, and a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a salt and pepper beard entered. "Ah, our patient is awake. Excellent, doctor." Jenkins moved to Willa's bedside and began examining her with efficient, gentle hands. "You gave us quite a scare, Miss Morgan. When Darren brought you in, I wasn't sure you'd make it through the night." "Thank you for taking care of me," Willa said, wincing as he prodded her ankle. "That's healing nicely," he pronounced. "But as I'm sure Mrs. Abernathy has told you, you'll need to stay off it for at least a week. After that, you can start putting some weight on it, but no long walks for at least a month." Willa's heart sank. A month? How was she supposed to teach with a bad ankle? And where would she stay? She had planned to board with a family in town until she found more permanent accommodations, but all her arrangements and her belongings were gone. "As if reading her thoughts, Doctor." Jenkins said, "Sheriff Jones recovered your trunk from the bandits. They've been caught, by the way. Tried to sell some of the stolen goods in Alpine and got themselves arrested." Relief flooded through Willa. "My things are safe, most of them. Your trunk is at the hotel waiting for you. As for your living situation, Mrs. Abernathy has graciously offered to let you stay with her until you're back on your feet." The elderly woman nodded. "I have a spare room, and it gets lonely in that big house since Mr. Abernathy passed. Besides, the school isn't far from my place. You can hobble there on crutches once you're feeling better." Tears sprang to Willa's eyes. "I don't know how to thank you, either of you. You've been so kind to a complete stranger." "That's how we do things out here," Dr. Jenkins said with a smile. "Now, Mrs. Abernathy will help you get dressed, and then I think there's someone waiting to see you." After the doctor left, Mrs. Abernathy helped Willa into a simple dress that she had altered to accommodate the bandaged ankle. "It's one of mine from years ago," she explained. "A bit old-fashioned, but it'll do until we can get to your own clothes." Once Willa was dressed and her hair had been brushed and arranged in a simple braid, Mrs. Abernathy handed her a pair of crutches. "Let's practice a bit before your visitor arrives." It took several frustrating attempts before Willa could maneuver around the small room without losing her balance. She was still adjusting her grip on the unfamiliar supports when a knock came at the door. "Come in," Mrs. Abernathy called. The door opened to reveal Darren Caldwell, his tall frame filling the doorway. He'd cleaned up since Willa last saw him. His dark hair was neatly combed, his jaw clean-shaven, and he wore a crisp white shirt under a black vest instead of the dusty trail clothes she remembered. "Miss Morgan," he said, removing his hat. "Good to see you up and about." "Mr. Caldwell," Willa replied, suddenly acutely aware of her borrowed dress and simple braid. "I owe you my life. Thank you for finding me." "Just doing what needed doing," he said with a small shrug. "Brought you these." He held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Mrs. Abernathy discreetly excused herself, closing the door behind her with a knowing smile that made Willa blush. Willa hobbled to a chair and sat down, setting the crutches aside before accepting the package. She unwrapped it to find a pair of leather gloves, finely made and just her size. For when you're on the crutches, Darren explained, prevents blisters. Touched by the thoughtful gift, Willa looked up at him with a genuine smile. That's very kind of you. Darren shifted his weight, seeming uncomfortable with her gratitude. Mayor asked me to tell you that the school board has postponed the start of classes for 2 weeks to give you time to recover. And Mrs. Peterson, she runs the mercantile. She's organized the ladies of the town to put together some things for you. Clothes and such, since what was in your trunk might not be practical for teaching out here. Willa was overwhelmed by the community's generosity. I don't know what to say. Say you'll join me for supper once you're steady on those crutches, Darren said, the words coming out in a rush. At the hotel restaurant, best food in town. Surprised by the invitation, Willa found herself nodding before she'd fully processed it. I'd like that. A smile transformed Darren's serious face, softening the hard lines and bringing a warmth to his gray eyes that made Willa's heart skip a beat. Good. I'll come by in a few days to check on you. After he left, Willa sat for a long time, the leather gloves in her lap, wondering what had possessed her to accept his invitation. She had come to Fort Davis to teach, not to get involved with a cowboy, no matter how handsome or heroic. And yet, there was something about Darren Caldwell that intrigued her, a quiet strength, an unassuming kindness. It was nothing like the calculated charm of the Boston gentleman she had known. Perhaps, Willa thought as she pulled on the gloves and reached for her crutches, Texas would surprise her in more ways than one. The next few days passed in a blur of visitors as the town of Fort Davis welcomed its new schoolteacher. Mrs. Abernathy's home became a revolving door of well-wishers, each bringing food, clothing, or offers of assistance. The mayor stopped by to formally welcome her, as did several members of the school board. Parents brought their children to meet their new teacher, and Willa began to learn the names and personalities of her future students. Through it all, Mrs. Abernathy was a steadfast presence, shooing away visitors when Willa needed rest and helping her practice with the crutches until she could move about with reasonable confidence. On the evening of her promised dinner with Darren, Willa found herself unusually nervous. She'd selected a dress from among those given to her by the town ladies, a modest blue calico that Mrs. Abernathy assured her brought out the color of her eyes, and had attempted to style her hair in a fashion more elegant than her usual simple braid. You look lovely, dear, Mrs. Abernathy said as she helped Willa with the final touches. Mr. Caldwell won't know what hit him. It's just dinner, Willa protested, though her flushed cheeks betrayed her. To thank him for rescuing me, Mrs. Abernathy made a non-committal sound as she pinned the last strand of Willa's copper hair into place. Of course it is, and I'm sure that's exactly why he asked you. Before Willa could respond, a knock at the door announced Darren's arrival. Mrs. Abernathy went to answer it while Willa took one last look in the mirror, adjusting the modest lace collar of her dress and taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. When she entered the parlor on her crutches, she found Darren standing by the fireplace, looking even more handsome than she remembered in a dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. He turned as she entered, and the admiration in his eyes made her momentarily forget the awkwardness of her crutches. Miss Morgan, he said, his deep voice warm. You look beautiful. Thank you, she replied, fighting a blush. And please call me Willa. Willa, he repeated, as if testing the name. Then you must call me Darren. Mrs. Abernathy watched their exchange with undisguised delight. Well now, you two had better be off. The hotel serves dinner until 8 and it's already past 7. Outside, Darren helped Willa into a small buggy, carefully arranging a blanket over her lap against the evening chill. The drive to the hotel was short, but it gave Willa her first real look at Fort Davis by twilight. The main street was lined with hitching posts and wooden sidewalks, with various businesses: the general store, a saloon, the sheriff's office spaced at regular intervals. Lanterns hung outside each establishment, casting warm pools of light onto the dusty street. The hotel was the tallest building in town, a two-story structure with a wide porch across the front. Darren helped Willa down from the buggy and offered his arm to supplement her crutches as they made their way inside. The hotel restaurant was modest but clean, with checkered tablecloths and simple centerpieces of local wildflowers. Several diners looked up as they entered, nodding in greeting to Darren and regarding Willa with curious interest. Once they were seated and had placed their orders: roast beef for Darren, chicken for Willa, an awkward silence fell between them. They both began at once, then laughed. "Ladies first," Darren said with a smile. Willa smoothed her napkin in her lap. "I wanted to thank you again for finding me. Dr. Jenkins told me I wouldn't have lasted another day out there." Darren's expression grew serious. "You're stronger than you look. Most city folk would have given up after the first night." "I almost did," Willa admitted. "But then I remembered something my father used to say: Morgan women don't quit. He died when I was 16, but those words stayed with me. And your mother? Gone since I was 12. Consumption." Willa's fingers unconsciously reached for the locket that was no longer around her neck. "I had their miniatures in a locket, but the bandits took it." Seeing her distress, Darren reached across the table and briefly touched her hand. "Sheriff Jones is still sorting through the recovered items. Perhaps it will turn up." Their food arrived, momentarily diverting the conversation. After the waitress left, Willa asked, "What about your family? Are they here in Fort Davis?" Darren shook his head. "My parents died when I was young. Wagon accident. I was raised by my uncle on a ranch near San Antonio. Came out here on my own when I was 20, worked cattle drives until I saved enough to buy my own land. Been building the Double C ever since." "The Double C, Caldwell Cattle Company," he explained with a hint of pride. "Started with 50 head in a run-down cabin. Now I've got over 500 head and a proper ranch house." "That's impressive," Willa said, genuinely admiring his accomplishment. "Do you run it alone?" "Got Javier, he's my foreman, and about a dozen hands. Miguel and Sam, who helped find you, are two of my best men." Darren took a sip of his coffee. "What about you? What brings a Boston lady all the way to Fort Davis to teach?" Willa considered how to answer. The truth was complicated, a mix of financial necessity, after her aunt's death left her without a home, a desire for independence that Boston society couldn't offer a single woman, and a dream of making a difference in children's lives. "I wanted an adventure," she said finally, offering a partial truth. "And the advertisement in the Boston Herald promised an opportunity to bring education and civilization to the frontier." Darren's mouth quirked in amusement. "And has Fort Davis lived up to your expectations of frontier life?" "Well, I certainly didn't expect to begin my adventure by getting lost in the wilderness," Willa replied with a small laugh. "But everyone has been kinder than I could have imagined. It's so different from Boston, where people can live next door to each other for years and never exchange more than a nod." "That's the thing about living out here," Darren said. "You learn quick that your neighbors are your lifeline. We look out for each other because we have to." The conversation flowed easily after that, moving from Willa's teaching experience in Boston to Darren's favorite cattle drive stories. She found herself laughing at his dry wit and impressed by his knowledge on subjects ranging from breeding stock to literature. He admitted to reading voraciously during the lonely winter months. By the time they finished dessert, A surprisingly delicious apple pie. Willa felt as if she had known Darren for years rather than days. There was an ease between them that she'd never experienced with any of the gentlemen in Boston. As they left the restaurant, Darren helped her back into the buggy. The night had grown chilly, and he tucked the blanket around her with careful attention. "I enjoyed this evening," Willa said as they drove back to Mrs. Abernathy's house. "Thank you. The pleasure was mine," Darren replied, his eyes briefly leaving the road to meet hers. "I was thinking the fall festival is coming up in a few weeks. It's the biggest social event of the year in Fort Davis. Would you allow me to escort you?" Willa hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd like that very much." When they reached Mrs. Abernathy's house, Darren helped her down from the buggy and walked her to the door. Under the porch lantern, his gray eyes looked almost silver as they gazed down at her. "Good night, Willa," he said softly. "Good night, Darren," she replied, suddenly very aware of how close they were standing. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, but instead he simply squeezed her hand gently before turning to leave. Willa watched him go, a strange mixture of disappointment and relief washing over her. Inside, Mrs. Abernathy was waiting up, pretending to be absorbed in her knitting but clearly eager for details. Willa satisfied her curiosity with a brief account of the evening, carefully omitting how her heart had raced when Darren's hand touched hers, or how she'd found herself watching his mouth as he spoke. That night, as Willa lay in bed, she found herself replaying every moment of the evening. It was foolish, she knew, to be so affected by one dinner with a man she barely knew. She had come to Fort Davis to be a teacher, not to lose her heart to a cowboy, no matter how kind or handsome. And yet, as sleep finally claimed her, it was Darren's face she saw behind her closed eyelids and his deep voice that echoed in her dreams. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity as Willa prepared for her first day of teaching. With the help of several town volunteers, the one-room schoolhouse was cleaned and readied for the new term. Desks were repaired, walls were whitewashed, and a new American flag was hung above the teacher's desk. Willa spent hours planning lessons, organizing supplies donated by the town, and continuing to meet the families of her future students. By the time her ankle had healed enough to walk without crutches, she felt reasonably prepared for the challenges ahead. Darren had been true to his word, stopping by regularly to check on her progress. Sometimes these visits were brief, just long enough to drop off a basket of fresh vegetables from his ranch garden, or to report on Sheriff Jones' ongoing search for her locket. Other times, he would stay for supper with her and Mrs. Abernathy, entertaining them with stories of ranch life or discussing the latest news from the territorial capital. Willa found herself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that both thrilled and alarmed her. She was building a life here, establishing herself as the town's teacher, and the last thing she needed was a distraction. And yet, whenever Darren smiled at her or their hands accidentally touched, all her sensible resolutions seemed to evaporate like morning dew under the Texas sun. The day before school was to begin, Willa was at the schoolhouse making final preparations when the door opened. Expecting Mrs. Abernathy with the lunch she had promised to bring, Willa turned with a smile that faltered when she saw Sheriff Jones instead. "Miss Morgan," he said, removing his hat. "Got a moment?" "Of course, Sheriff." Willa set down the chalk she had been using to write the next day's lessons on the blackboard. "What can I do for you?" The sheriff approached, something clutched in his hand. "We finally finished sorting through all the items recovered from those bandits. Found this among them." He held out his hand, revealing Willa's silver locket. Tears sprang to her eyes as she took it. "Oh, I never thought I'd see it again. Thank you." Sheriff Jones shifted uncomfortably in the face of her emotion. "Just doing my job, madam. Thought you might want it right away." After the sheriff left, Willa sat at her desk, carefully cleaning the tarnished silver with her handkerchief. The clasp had been damaged, but the locket itself was intact, as were the tiny portraits inside. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear the door open again. "Is everything all right?" Willa looked up to find Darren standing just inside the doorway, concern evident in his expression. "Everything's wonderful," she said, holding up the locket. "Sheriff Jones found it among the bandits' things." Darren's face broke into a smile as he crossed the room to her desk. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the locket. Willa handed it to him, and he examined it carefully. "Clasp is broken, but that's an easy fix. Old Todd at the livery has a knack for small repairs like this. Want me to take it to him?" "Would you? I'd go myself, but I still have so much to do before tomorrow. Consider it done." Darren pocketed the locket, then glanced around the schoolhouse. "Place looks good. You've worked hard." "I couldn't have done it without everyone's help," Willa said. "This town has been so welcoming." "Fort Davis takes care of its own," Darren replied, "and you're one of us now." The simple statement warmed Willa more than she expected. One of us. She had never really felt that sense of belonging in Boston, where her status as an orphan living on her aunt's charity had always set her slightly apart. "I should let you get back to your preparations," Darren said after a moment. "Just wanted to see if you needed anything before tomorrow." "Actually," Willa said, "I could use some help hanging this map. It's heavier than it looks." Together, they managed to mount the large map of the United States on the wall behind her desk. Standing side by side, arms reaching up to hold the map in place while Willa hammered in the nails, Willa was acutely conscious of Darren's proximity, of the clean scent of soap and leather that seemed to cling to him. When the task was complete, they stepped back to admire their work, and Willa found herself saying, "Would you like to stay for lunch? Mrs. Abernathy is bringing enough for two, and she'd be delighted if you joined us." Darren's smile was answer enough. Mrs. Abernathy did indeed seem pleased to find Darren at the schoolhouse when she arrived with the picnic basket. The three of them enjoyed a simple but delicious meal of fried chicken, biscuits, and fresh apple cider at one of the student desks, which was comically small for Darren's large frame. As they were cleaning up, Mrs. Abernathy suddenly exclaimed, "Oh, I nearly forgot. Reverend Phillips asked me to remind you both about choir practice tonight. The fall festival is only a week away, and the choir is performing on the opening night." Willa and Darren exchanged surprised glances. "I'm not in the choir," Willa said. At the same time, Darren protested, "I don't sing." Mrs. Abernathy waved away their objections. "Reverend Phillips specifically asked for you both. Said the choir needs more voices, and it's a good way for Willa to meet more of the townspeople." "Practice is at 7 at the church." After she left, Willa and Darren looked at each other helplessly. "You sing?" Willa asked. "Not unless you count humming to the cattle on night watch," Darren replied with a wry smile. I was in the choir at school, but that was years ago." Willa hesitated. "We don't have to go," and face Mrs. Abernathy's disappointment. "I'd rather face a stampede," Darren said. "I'll pick you up at 6:45. That evening, as promised, Darren arrived at Mrs. Abernathy's house promptly at 6:45. The church was only a short walk away, and the early autumn evening was pleasant enough to go on foot, especially since Willa's ankle had improved significantly. The church choir, it turned out, was less about musical talent and more about community participation. Under Reverend Phillips' enthusiastic but not particularly skilled direction, they practiced a selection of hymns and folk songs for the festival. Willa, placed among the sopranos, found herself enjoying the simple pleasure of singing with others. Darren, relegated to the back row of bases, looked less comfortable but gamely followed along. After practice, as they walked back to Mrs. Abernathy's house, Darren reached into his pocket. "Almost forgot. Got this back from old Todd." He handed Willa her locket, the clasp now repaired and the silver polished to a high shine. "It's beautiful," Willa said, stopping under a street lamp to open it and look at the tiny portraits inside. "These are the only images I have of my parents. I can't thank you enough for getting it fixed." "May I?" Darren asked, taking the locket and stepping behind her. With gentle fingers, he fastened it around her neck, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. When Willa turned to face him, their eyes met, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. Slowly, as if giving her time to step away, Darren leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. It was brief, just the softest touch of his mouth against hers, but when he pulled back, Willa felt as if something fundamental had shifted between them. "I've been wanting to do that since the night of our dinner," Darren admitted, his voice low. "I've been hoping you would," Willa replied, surprising herself with her boldness. Darren's smile in response was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He offered her his arm, and they continued their walk in a silence that hummed with new possibilities. At Mrs. Abernathy's gate, Darren kissed her once more, slightly longer this time, but still maintaining the propriety expected of a gentleman. "Good night, Willa." "Good luck tomorrow with the children." "Good night, Darren. Thank you for everything." As she watched him walk away, Willa touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. For the first time since arriving in Fort Davis, she didn't think about Boston at all. Willa's first day as the teacher of Fort Davis School was both exhausting and exhilarating. Her 23 students ranged in age from 6 to 16 and represented a diverse cross-section of the community. The children of ranchers, merchants, laborers, and even the town's small Mexican population. By the end of the day, Willa was hoarse from talking and her still tender ankle was throbbing, but she felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she'd experienced before. These children were eager to learn, if somewhat unruly, and she was determined to give them the best education possible. As she was locking up the schoolhouse, a small bouquet of wildflowers appeared in front of her. She turned to find Darren standing there, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Thought you might need these after your first day," he said. "Teaching can be as tough as breaking wild horses, or so I hear." Willa accepted the flowers with a laugh. "It certainly felt that way at times today, but I think I'm going to love it." "Walk with me?" Darren asked, offering his arm. "Mrs. Abernathy told me you usually don't get home until 5, so I thought I'd catch you here." They strolled through town at a leisurely pace, Willa sharing stories from her first day while Darren listened with genuine interest. When they reached the creek that ran along the edge of town, they sat on a fallen log, watching the water flow by. "I've been thinking," Darren said after a comfortable silence. "The fall festival is this Saturday, and I know I already asked to escort you, but I was wondering if you might like to come out to the ranch on Sunday. I could show you around, and Mrs. Rodriguez, my housekeeper, makes the best chili in the territory." Willa considered the invitation. Spending a day alone with Darren at his ranch would certainly raise eyebrows in town, regardless of the presence of his housekeeper. Seeing her hesitation, Darren added, "Mrs. Abernathy is welcome to come along, of course, and Javier's wife will be there too. She and Mrs. Rodriguez are sisters." Relieved by this clarification, Willa nodded. "I'd like that very much, and I'm sure Mrs. Abernathy would enjoy the outing as well." They sat talking until the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the creek. Finally, Darren stood and helped Willa to her feet. "I'd better get you back before Mrs. Abernathy sends out a search party." As they walked back through town, several people greeted them with knowing smiles. Willa realized that their growing attachment hadn't gone unnoticed by the observant citizens of Fort Davis. The rest of the week passed in a blur of teaching, choir practice, and preparations for the fall festival. Darren stopped by the schoolhouse each afternoon to walk Willa home, a routine that quickly became the highlight of her day. Sometimes they would take the direct route back to Mrs. Abernathy's, but more often they would wander along the creek or through the town square, talking about everything and nothing. By the time Saturday arrived, Willa had heard the story of how Darren had saved his first calf during a blizzard, how he'd won his prized stallion in a poker game he hadn't intended to join, and how he'd once accidentally set fire to his uncle's barn while trying to smoke a rabbit out of hiding. In return, she'd told him about her childhood in Boston, her dreams of traveling to Europe, and her disastrous attempt to learn to paint. The fall festival was held in the large meadow just outside town, with booths set up for games, food, and various displays of local crafts. When Darren arrived to escort Willa and Mrs. Abernathy, he was dressed in his Sunday best, with a new hat and polished boots. "You look very handsome," Willa said as he helped her into his buggy. "And you look beautiful," he replied, his eyes taking in her green dress, which Mrs. Peterson had helped her alter to be more suitable for a festive occasion. Mrs. Abernathy, watching from the porch, called out, "You two go on ahead. Mabel Thompson is picking me up in her wagon. We have to get there early to set up the jam competition." Darren and Willa exchanged amused glances. Mrs. Abernathy's subtle attempts to give them time alone had become increasingly transparent over the past week. "Are you sure?" Willa asked. "Absolutely," Mrs. Abernathy insisted. "Don't worry about me. Enjoy yourselves." As they drove to the festival grounds, Darren explained the various traditions associated with the event. "There's apple bobbing for the children, shooting contests for the men, quilting displays from the ladies, and enough food to feed an army. Tonight there'll be a dance in the big tent they've set up." "It sounds wonderful," Willa said. "We had harvest festivals in Massachusetts, but nothing quite so elaborate. It's the biggest social event of the year. People come from miles around, ranchers who might only make it to town a few times a year, families from the outlying homesteads. It's a chance for everyone to catch up before winter sets in." The festival was indeed impressive, with colorful bunting decorating the booths and the mouth-watering smells of barbecue, pies, and roasted corn filling the air. Darren seemed to know everyone, introducing Willa to so many people that she quickly lost track of names. They wandered from booth to booth, trying various foods and watching the competitions. Darren participated in the shooting contest, placing second to the sheriff, much to his good-natured chagrin. Willa found herself cheering loudly for him, caught up in the excitement of the crowd. As the afternoon wore on, they found a quiet spot under a large oak tree away from the main festivities. "Having fun?" Darren asked, handing Willa a cup of cider. "More than I expected," she admitted. "Everyone has been so friendly." "They like you," Darren said simply. "You've made quite an impression in your short time here." Willa sipped her cider, thinking about how different her life was now compared to just a month ago. In Boston, she had been just one more unmarried young woman of modest means, expected to find a husband or resign herself to spinsterhood. Here, she was Miss Morgan, the teacher respected for her own abilities and welcomed for herself. And then there was Darren. In the span of a few weeks, he had become central to her happiness in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. As if reading her thoughts, Darren reached over and took her hand. "Willa, I know it hasn't been long, but I want you to know that whatever he had been about to say was interrupted by the sound of the church bell, signaling that it was time for the choir performance." Willa felt a pang of disappointment as Darren helped her to her feet. "We'd better not be late," he said. "Reverend Phillips will have our hides." The choir performance went better than anyone had expected, with even Darren managing to stay mostly in tune. Afterward, as the sun began to set, lanterns were lit around the festival grounds, creating a magical atmosphere. Tables were cleared from the large tent to make room for dancing, and a small band of local musicians set up their instruments. Darren led Willa onto the dance floor for the first waltz, his hand warm and steady at her waist. Despite his claims of having 2 left feet, he moved with surprising grace, guiding her smoothly through the steps. "You dance well for a cowboy," Willa teased. "My uncle insisted I learn. Said no nephew of his was going to embarrass him at social gatherings." Darren pulled her slightly closer as they turned. "Besides, it gives me an excuse to hold you." Willa blushed but didn't pull away. As they continued to dance, she became increasingly aware of the solid strength of his arm around her, the subtle scent of his shaving soap, and the way his eyes never left her face. They danced several more times throughout the evening, but also took breaks to socialize with others. Willa was pleased to see many of her students and their families, all eager to tell her how much they were enjoying school under her direction. As the night grew later, the music slowed, and the crowd thinned as families with young children headed home. During one particularly romantic melody, Darren led Willa to the edge of the dance floor, where the lantern light barely reached. "You never got to finish what you were saying earlier," Willa said softly as they swayed to the music. "Before the choir performance." Darren's arms tightened around her. "I was going to say that I know it hasn't been long, but I care for you, Willa, more than I've cared for anyone in a long time, maybe ever." Willa's heart raced at his admission. "I care for you too, Darren." He smiled, a tender expression that made her knees feel suddenly weak. "I'm not a man for flowery words or grand gestures, but I want you to know that my intentions are serious. I'm not just passing time with you." "I know," Willa whispered, understanding the significance of what he was saying. In a place like Fort Davis, a man didn't court a woman unless he was considering marriage. The thought should have terrified her. A month ago, it would have. But now, looking up into Darren's steady gray eyes, all she felt was a quiet certainty that this was right. As the music ended, Darren led her away from the dance floor, toward the edge of the festival grounds where the darkness offered privacy. There, beneath the canopy of stars, he took her face in his hands and kissed her with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally broke apart, Darren rested his forehead against hers. "I should take you back to Mrs. Abernathy's before we cause a scandal," Willa nodded, though she was reluctant for the evening to end. "Yes, I suppose we should." They found Mrs. Abernathy chatting with a group of ladies by the jam display. She took one look at their flushed faces and bright eyes and smiled knowingly. "Ready to head home, dear? I was just about to look for you." The ride back to town was quiet, all three lost in their own thoughts. When they reached Mrs. Abernathy's house, the elderly woman tactfully went inside first, leaving Darren and Willa alone on the porch. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," Willa said, her hand still in his. "The pleasure was mine." Darren brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I'll come by tomorrow around noon to take you and Mrs. Abernathy out to the ranch. I'm looking forward to it." Willa hesitated, then stood on tiptoe to kiss him lightly. "Good night, Darren." His smile as he left made her feel as if she could float up the stairs to her room. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect autumn day for a drive to the Double C Ranch. Willa dressed carefully in a practical blue skirt and white shirtwaist, with sturdy boots for walking around the ranch. She was braiding her hair when Mrs. Abernathy knocked on her door. "Willa, dear, I'm afraid I won't be able to join you today. Mrs. Thompson has taken ill and I've promised to look after her." Willa frowned. "Then perhaps I should stay as well. I could help you with Mrs. Thompson." "Nonsense. There's no need for both of us to miss a lovely day at the ranch. Besides, Mr. Caldwell is counting on showing you his home." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes twinkled. "Mrs. Rodriguez will be there as chaperone, and no one in town would dare question your propriety." Willa hesitated. Going to Darren's ranch alone would certainly cause talk, regardless of the presence of his housekeeper. On the other hand, the prospect of spending the day with him was too tempting to refuse, if you're sure. "Absolutely certain," Mrs. Abernathy said firmly. "Now finish getting ready. He'll be here soon." When Darren arrived, he accepted the change in plans with equanimity, though Willa thought she detected a hint of pleased surprise in his expression. The drive to the Double C took about an hour, during which Darren pointed out various landmarks and told stories about the land they passed through. "My first year here, that creek flooded and washed away half my fence line," he said, gesturing to a seemingly innocent stream. "Spent 2 weeks rebuilding it, only to have another storm take it out again. Finally figured out a better route for the fence." As they crested a hill, the Double C came into view. Nestled in a valley with mountains rising behind it, the ranch was more impressive than Willa had expected. A large 2-story house built of native stone and timber dominated the scene, with various outbuildings, corrals, and barns arranged nearby. In the distance, cattle grazed on the rolling grasslands. "Darren, it's beautiful," Willa breathed, taking in the peaceful scene. "Built most of it myself," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "Started with just the center part of the house and added on as the ranch grew. Still not finished planning to add a proper library next spring." As they approached, a middle-aged woman with a kind face emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Several ranch hands appeared as well, curious about their boss's visitor. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Darren called as he helped Willa down from the buggy. "This is Miss Morgan, Fort Davis's new schoolteacher." "Welcome, Miss Morgan," Mrs. Rodriguez said warmly. "Mr. Caldwell has told us much about you. Please come inside. Lunch is almost ready." The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior, spacious, well-built, and furnished with a combination of practical pieces and unexpected luxuries. A beautiful piano stood in one corner of the parlor, and bookshelves lined one wall, filled with more volumes than Willa had expected to see in a ranch house. "You play?" she asked, gesturing to the piano. Darren shook his head. "Bought it thinking I might learn someday, but never found the time. It mostly sits there looking pretty." After a delicious lunch of chili, cornbread, and fresh apple pie, Darren took Willa on a tour of the ranch. They visited the barn, where he introduced her to Thunder and the other horses, the corral, where a new colt was just learning to accept a saddle, and the small but thriving garden that supplied the house with vegetables. Everywhere they went, Willa was struck by the evident pride Darren took in his ranch and the respect his employees showed him. It was clear that the Double C was not just a business to him, but a labor of love. As the afternoon waned, they walked to a small rise behind the house, where a bench had been placed to take advantage of the view. The setting sun bathed the valley in golden light, turning the distant mountains purple against the sky. "I can see why you love it here," Willa said as they sat side by side. "It's so peaceful." "Not always," Darren chuckled. During calving season or roundup, it's about as peaceful as a saloon on payday, but yes, most of the time it's a good place to be. He turned to look at her. Do you think you could be happy in a place like this, Willa? The question hung in the air between them, its implications clear. Willa looked out over the land that Darren had built with his own hands, thinking of the life she might have here. It would be so different from what she had imagined for herself. No bustling city streets, no grand cultural institutions, none of the refinements she had grown up with. And yet, as she turned back to Darren, seeing the mixture of hope and vulnerability in his eyes, she knew that none of those things mattered as much as the man beside her. "Yes," she said simply, "I think I could be very happy here." Darren's face lit up with a joy that made Willa's heart swell. He took her hands in his touch gentle despite the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. "I know it's soon," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Too soon, maybe, but I've never been one to waste time once I know what I want. And what I want, Willa Morgan, is to spend my life with you." Willa's breath caught in her throat. "Darren, are you—" "Not yet," he said quickly. "I'm not asking yet. That deserves to be done properly, with a ring and maybe not sitting on a bench covered in dust." His crooked smile made her laugh despite the tears that had sprung to her eyes. "But I wanted you to know where my heart stands, and to give you time to be sure of your own." Willa squeezed his hands. "My heart is already sure," she whispered. "But you're right, we should take a little time, get to know each other better. How does a month sound?" Darren asked, only half joking. 3 months, Willa countered, her practical nature asserting itself. "Until Christmas, if we still feel the same then." "We will," Darren said with absolute certainty. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that held all the promise of the future they were beginning to envision together. As the sun sank behind the mountains, they walked back to the house hand in hand, both knowing that something precious and lasting had begun on that hilltop bench. The autumn months passed in a whirl of work and courtship for Willa and Darren. During the week, Willa threw herself into teaching, determined to prove herself worthy of the town's trust. On weekends, Darren would often take her for drives in the countryside or on picnics by the creek when the weather permitted. They attended church together on Sundays, their relationship now an accepted fact among the townspeople. Mrs. Abernathy, having accomplished her matchmaking mission, turned her attention to practical matters, teaching Willa the skills she would need as a rancher's wife, preserving food, making soap, and treating common ailments when a doctor wasn't available. Though Willa had been raised in the city, she proved an apt pupil, eager to learn everything she could about her new home. Darren, for his part, made more frequent trips to town than he ever had before, often finding excuses to stop by the schoolhouse at the end of the day. He brought small gifts, a ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry, once even a kitten he'd rescued from a hollow log, which became the school's official mouser. As October turned to November, preparations began for Thanksgiving. The school would be closed for a week, and Darren invited Willa to spend the holiday at the ranch. "Mrs. Rodriguez's sister and her family will be staying with us, and I've invited a few neighbors as well," he explained. "It would mean a lot to have you there." Willa agreed eagerly, looking forward to experiencing her first Thanksgiving in Texas. When she mentioned the plan to Mrs. Abernathy, the older woman nodded approvingly. "A good chance to see how you fit into ranch life before any permanent decisions are made," she said sagely. "Though I don't think either of you has much doubt about the outcome." On the day before Thanksgiving, Darren arrived to pick up Willa, his wagon loaded with supplies for the holiday feast. The drive to the ranch was filled with comfortable conversation and shared plans for the week ahead. When they arrived, Willa was surprised to find that Darren had made some changes to the house since her last visit. The parlor had been rearranged to accommodate more seating, new curtains hung at the windows, and a writing desk had been placed in a sunny corner. "You like it?" Darren asked, watching her reaction. "Mrs. Rodriguez and I thought the place could use a woman's touch. The desk is yours for writing letters or preparing lessons when you're here." Touched by his thoughtfulness, Willa ran her hand over the smooth surface of the desk. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and crisp. The house soon filled with the delicious smells of roasting turkey, baking bread, and pumpkin pies. Willa spent the morning helping Mrs. Rodriguez and Javier's wife, Elena, in the kitchen, enjoying the camaraderie of working together to prepare the feast. By mid-afternoon, the other guests had arrived, two neighboring ranchers with their families and the local doctor and his wife, who had ridden all the way from Fort Davis. The dining room table, extended to its full length, groaned under the weight of the food. As everyone took their seats, Darren, at the head of the table, asked for a moment of silence for the blessing. Looking around at the faces, some familiar, some new, all welcome, Willa felt a surge of gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this place and these people. After the meal, as the men retired to the porch for pipes and the women gathered in the parlor to chat, Darren caught Willa's hand and led her outside to the bench on the hill. Though the November air was chilly, the setting sun cast enough warmth to make it comfortable. "Happy?" he asked, wrapping his arm around her. "Very," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "It's been a wonderful day." "I have something for you," Darren said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Curious, Willa unwrapped it to find a delicate silver bracelet set with small turquoise stones. "Darren, it's beautiful. It belonged to my mother," he explained as he fastened it around her wrist. "My uncle gave it to me before he died, said I should give it to the woman I wanted to spend my life with." Willa traced the intricate silver work with her finger, deeply moved by the gesture. "I'll treasure it always." "There's something else," Darren continued, his voice growing serious. "I know we agreed to wait until Christmas," but he took a deep breath. "Willa, these past months have been the happiest of my life. I'm more certain every day that you're the woman I want beside me as my wife and partner. I know I'm just a rough cowboy and you deserve you," Willa interrupted, placing her fingers gently over his lips. "I deserve you, Darren Caldwell, and you deserve someone who loves you as much as I do." Darren's eyes widened at her declaration, then crinkled with joy. "You love me?" "With all my heart," Willa said simply. In response, Darren reached into his pocket once more and withdrew a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a gold ring set with a modest diamond surrounded by smaller sapphires. "Wilhelmina Morgan," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Willa whispered, tears of happiness streaming down her face. "Yes, Darren, I will marry you." With hands that trembled slightly, Darren slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. He kissed her then, a kiss that sealed their promise and spoke of all the years they would share. When they returned to the house, hand in hand and beaming, their announcement was met with cheers and congratulations. It seemed that everyone had been expecting this moment, perhaps even before Willa and Darren had recognized it themselves. Later that night, as Willa prepared for bed in the guest room, she stood at the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape of what would soon be her home. The journey that had begun with terror and confusion in the wilderness had led her to a happiness she had never imagined possible. As she twirled her engagement ring around her finger, Willa thought of Darren's words when he had found her in the canyon, exhausted and injured. "Follow me home." She hadn't understood then that home wasn't just a place, but a person, and she had found both in Darren Caldwell. The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas flew by in a flurry of wedding preparations. Willa and Darren had decided on a Christmas Eve wedding, a time when the whole town could celebrate with them. Mrs. Abernathy took charge of organizing the ladies of Fort Davis to prepare food for the reception, while Reverend Phillips counseled the couple on the responsibilities of marriage. Willa continued teaching, though her students were increasingly distracted by both the approaching holiday and the excitement of their teacher's wedding. She used their interest to her advantage, incorporating wedding customs from different cultures into her history lessons, and having the children write poetry about love and commitment for their composition practice. In the evenings, she worked on preparing for her new life at the Double C. There was a trousseau to assemble, household items to collect, and countless decisions to make about the running of the ranch house. Mrs. Rodriguez had made it clear that she was happy to continue as housekeeper, a relief to Willa, who was still mastering the basics of frontier housekeeping. Darren, meanwhile, threw himself into completing the library addition to the house, determined to have it finished before Christmas. He also arranged for improvements to the school teacher's house in town, which would remain vacant until a new teacher could be found for the next school year. "The school board has agreed to let you finish out the term," he told Willa one evening as they sat by the fire in Mrs. Abernathy's parlor. "They'll start looking for a replacement in the spring to take over in September." Willa nodded, a touch of sadness mingling with her happiness. "I'll miss teaching," she admitted. "I've come to love my students." Darren took her hand, his thumb rubbing gently over her engagement ring. "I've been thinking about that. There are several ranch children in the area who don't get to attend school because they live too far from town. What would you think about teaching them at the ranch? We could convert one of the outbuildings into a small schoolhouse." Willa's face lit up at the suggestion. "Darren, that's a wonderful idea. Do you really think it would work, with you as the teacher?" "I have no doubt." He smiled at her enthusiasm. "We can talk to the parents after the holidays, see how many families might be interested." 2 days before the wedding, Willa received an unexpected letter from Boston from her aunt's former housekeeper, who had kept in touch after the aunt's death. The letter contained surprising news. Willa's aunt had left a small trust fund for her that had only recently been discovered among the old woman's papers. The sum wasn't large, but it was enough to provide a modest independence. When she shared the news with Darren during his evening visit, his reaction surprised her. "That's wonderful, Willa. Now you'll have something that's yours alone, no matter what. You're not worried that I might be more independent than a proper wife should be?" She teased, though there was a genuine question behind her words. Darren's laugh was warm and sincere. "Sweetheart, if I wanted a docile, dependent wife, I wouldn't be marrying a woman who survived alone in the wilderness for days and then took on a classroom full of frontier children." He pulled her into his arms. "Your strength and independence are part of what I love about you." On Christmas Eve, Fort Davis was transformed. The church was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, and candles glowed in every window. Though snow was rare in this part of Texas, a light dusting had fallen overnight, adding to the festive atmosphere. In Mrs. Abernathy's spare bedroom, which had been Willa's home these past months, a flurry of activity surrounded the bride. Mrs. Peterson had arrived early to help with Willa's hair, arranging the copper tresses in an elegant style adorned with small white flowers. Elena and Mrs. Rodriguez had come from the ranch, bringing with them the beautiful lace veil that had been Darren's mother's. Willa's wedding dress was a creation of ivory silk that Mrs. Abernathy had helped her design, and so, with a high collar, fitted bodice, and modest train. As she stood before the mirror, barely recognizing the elegant woman who looked back at her, Willa thought of how far she had come from the frightened, disheveled woman who had stumbled through the wilderness just a few months ago. "You look beautiful, dear Mrs. Abernathy said, her eyes misty with unshed tears, like a proper Texas bride. A knock at the door heralded the arrival of Sheriff Jones, who had agreed to give Willa away in the absence of any male relatives. "It's time, Miss Morgan," he said, looking uncharacteristically smart in his Sunday best. "Everyone's waiting at the church." The short walk to the church was like a dream. The entire town seemed to have turned out, lining the path and calling out good wishes as Willa passed. When they reached the church steps, Sheriff Jones offered his arm, and together they walked through the doors into the candlelit sanctuary. Willa's eyes immediately found Darren, standing tall and handsome at the altar in a new black suit. The look on his face as he saw her, a mixture of awe, love, and pride, was one she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion. Reverend Phillips spoke eloquently about the nature of love and the sacred bond of marriage. Darren's voice was steady as he repeated his vows, his eyes never leaving Willa's face. When it came her turn, Willa was surprised by the clarity and strength of her own voice as she promised to love, honor, and cherish this man who had found her in the wilderness and shown her the way home. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Phillips concluded, "I now pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss your bride." Darren's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, a fitting beginning to their life together. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors as Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell for the first time, the church erupted in cheers and applause. The reception that followed at the town hall was a joyous celebration that lasted well into the night. There was dancing, feasting, and much toasting to the health and happiness of the newlyweds. Willa danced not only with her new husband, but also with Sheriff Jones, Dr. Jenkins, and many of the ranchers and townsmen who had welcomed her to their community. As midnight approached, Darren found Willa in conversation with some of her students' mothers. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Caldwell?" he asked, the new name bringing a smile to both their faces. They departed amid a shower of rice and good wishes, climbing into the sleigh that Darren had borrowed for the occasion. The ride to the Double C was magical, with the moon illuminating the light covering of snow and the stars seeming to bless their journey. When they arrived at the ranch, Darren insisted on carrying Willa across the threshold, a tradition she had read about but never expected to experience. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming, with a fire burning in the hearth and candles lit in the parlor. "Welcome home, Willa," Darren said softly as he set her on her feet. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, husband," she replied, still savoring the newness of the word on her tongue. Darren reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box tied with a red ribbon. "One more gift," he said, placing it in her hands. "I was saving it for Christmas morning, but I can't wait." Willa opened the box to find a key nestled on a bed of velvet. "What's this for?" "Your library," Darren said, taking her hand and leading her toward the new addition to the house. "I finished it yesterday." He unlocked the door and ushered her inside. Willa gasped in delight. The room was everything she could have wished for: bookshelves from floor to ceiling, comfortable chairs by the fireplace, a large desk by the window with a view of the mountains, and best of all, the shelves were already filled with books. "Darren, how did you been collecting them for years?" he admitted. "Always wanted a proper library, just needed the right person to share it with. And I may have asked Mrs. Abernathy to find out which books you missed most from your Boston days." Overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness, Willa threw her arms around his neck. "It's perfect. You're perfect." "Not perfect," Darren said, holding her close, "but perfectly yours." As snow began to fall again outside the window, Darren and Willa stood in their library in their home, at the beginning of their life together. The journey that had begun in fear and confusion had led to a love neither of them had expected but both now cherished above all else. Epilogue: 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the Double C Ranch as Willa Caldwell walked slowly from the garden to the house, a basket of fresh vegetables on her arm and her free hand resting on her swollen belly. At 8 months pregnant with their second child, she had learned to pace herself, especially in the heat of a Texas summer. Inside the cool dimness of the kitchen, Mrs. Rodriguez looked up from the bread she was kneading. "You should not be out in this heat, Senora," she scolded gently. "The garden can wait." "I needed the exercise," Willa replied, setting down her basket. "And these tomatoes wouldn't wait another day." The sound of hoofbeats drew her to the window, where she saw Darren riding in with their 3-year-old son, Daniel, perched in front of him on the saddle. The boy's copper hair, so like Willa's own, gleamed in the sunlight, and his delighted laughter carried across the yard. Willa stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes with her hand as she watched her husband and son dismount. Daniel ran to her as fast as his little legs would carry him, while Darren followed at a more measured pace, his face lighting up as it always did when he saw her. "Mama, I rode Thunder," Daniel exclaimed, throwing his arms around her legs. "All by myself." "With Papa's help," Darren corrected, stepping onto the porch to kiss Willa's cheek. "But he did sit tall in the saddle, just like a real cowboy." "I am a real cowboy," Daniel protested. "Uncle Miguel said so." Willa laughed, ruffling her son's hair. "A very real cowboy who needs a bath before supper. Run along inside and ask Mrs. Rodriguez to help you." Once Daniel had scampered inside, Darren pulled Willa into his arms, mindful of her pregnant belly. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his hand gently caressing the place where their second child grew. "Better now that you're home," she said, leaning into his embrace. "How was the roundup?" "Successful. We've got a good herd this year." He guided her to the porch swing and sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "Miguel's handling the last of it. I wanted to be home with you." 5 years of marriage had only deepened Willa's love for this man, who had tracked her through the wilderness and brought her home. The Double C had prospered under their joint care, Darren managing the cattle and land, Willa overseeing the accounts and running the small school they had established for the children of neighboring ranches. Life hadn't always been easy. They had weathered drought, illness, and the occasional dispute with less scrupulous neighbors. But through it all, they had faced challenges together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. "I received a letter from Mrs. Abernathy today," Willa said, reaching for the envelope on the small table beside the swing. "She's visiting her sister in Austin but plans to be back in time for the baby's birth." "Good," Darren nodded approvingly. "Wouldn't feel right without her here." Mrs. Abernathy had become like a mother to both of them, especially after her house in town had been damaged by fire 2 years earlier. She now lived at the Double C for most of the year, occupying a comfortable suite of rooms that Darren had added especially for her. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Willa rested her head on Darren's shoulder. "Are you happy?" she asked, a question she still posed occasionally, as if to reassure herself that the life they had built together was real. Darren's answer was always the same, but never less sincere. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he said, kissing the top of her head. "You and Daniel and this little one on the way, you're everything to me, Willa." From inside the house came the sound of Daniel's laughter as Mrs. Rodriguez prepared him for dinner. The evening breeze carried the scent of sage and the distant lowing of cattle. In the western sky, the first stars were beginning to appear. Willa thought back to that terrifying time when she had been lost in the wilderness, certain that she would never find her way out. How strange and wonderful that her darkest moment had led her to the greatest happiness she had ever known. "When I found you in that ravine," Darren said, as if reading her thoughts, "I never imagined where that day would lead us. When you said follow me home, I had no idea what home really meant," Willa replied, taking his hand. "Now I know it was always you." As darkness settled over the Double C Ranch, Darren and Willa Caldwell sat together on their porch, surrounded by the life they had created, not just the buildings and the land, but the love and family that had grown from a chance encounter in the wilderness. It was a love born of courage and kindness, tempered by challenges and strengthened by shared dreams. And as the evening star shone bright above the Texas horizon, they knew with absolute certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be together, home at last.